Okay. What is going on? There we go. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming. If you just kind of wandered in, or if your phone just told you that there was an Instagram thing tonight and you're checking it out, I am celebrating the fact that the podcast that I've been working on for a really long time was just released today after more than a year of delays from COVID. So a really sweet friend of mine sent me a bottle in the mail. so clever. Thanks, Maureen. And I thought to mark the occasion, I would answer some questions that people might have after listening to the first episode. Man, the questions were were really challenging. They were a lot better than the casual listener might provide. You know, I initially thought we were going to be talking about, I don't know, file transfers or microphones and stuff, but just some really great, like, philosophy of science questions came in. So, while I queue them up, I'm hiding them on a computer that's right behind my phone. Will you just let me know where you're watching from? I see some familiar names. California. I saw South Africa. I know it's late there. Thanks, Bree. That's a good question. Where can we get the podcast? It's available on almost every platform. The podcast is called Deeply Human. And the reason it's on almost every platform is because it's like a big partnership between the BBC and American Public Media, which is a really big production company here. So for me, more acclimated to indie scale. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot to learn, exciting, a lot of resources, smart people. Okay, I'm diving in. Minneapolis is in the house, Chicago, St. Paul, tight, George Floyd Square, no joke, hell yes. Okay, so the first episode, if you haven't yet made it all the way through, investigated through a scientific lens romantic compatibility. And I spoke to a couple of people. One, Dr. Helen Fisher, who is a researcher who I've been interested in for a long time. She had, in fact, inspired some of the work that I'd done on stage and some of what I've written about. It was like a TED Talk that I'd seen her present, in which she described her own research into essentially the neurological, neuroanatomical coordinates of love. So, like, if you put somebody in an fMRI machine and they think about the person that they're in love with, are there predictable structures that engage? You know, is there like a certain part of the brain? Because if you put me in an fMRI machine and then you have me speak or listen or imagine something, you can see patterns about the neuroanatomical structures that are associated with that. And she found that, there was a signature kind of reliably appearing in a particular portion of the brain. Then she went on to try to figure out if there were predictions that she could make about the kind of people who were likely to partner with one another. Bailey had asked me, how did it feel to talk with her? I was nervous. She's a powerhouse, you know. She's excited about what she does, and I've been really excited about her work too. So it was fun in that sense to like geek out and listen to someone talk about what they dig. Of course, on the other hand, it's like, you know, I'm there not just as it's not a hang, right? Like, they're live mics. And I want to make sure, even in my excitement and in my enthusiasm, to be rigorous, you know, to ask the questions that I don't understand the answers to yet, or to ask for clarification. And, it was exciting. Yeah, and also she's just like, if you've seen her TED Talk, you know, she's a personality with like a momentum of her own on stage and in the booth. So, yeah. And the other expert that I spoke to, mentioned now by Liz Athens, is Dr. Barry Schwartz. And he's studied the way that humans choose. And he's usually done that like in a sphere other than the romantic domain, you know. So he's designing experiments very often in the retail sphere about how people buy things at like grocery stores, or, you know, we talked about how people might apartment shop. And his work was compelling in a way that is my favorite, which is it challenged a fundamental intuition in a way that was very difficult to casually rebuff, because he was supported by some evidence that was not easily dismissible. So it made me think about the way that I maneuver through the world slightly differently. I spent a lot of time choosing things. So in Barry's typography, I would be a maximizer, right? I'm always looking for the best thing, the best choice. But I think a lot of us, maybe even more so in the past year, when the limits on our times have eroded in some way, right? We're not leaving the house. We don't have a meeting. Like, you can sit and online shop for a minor household item almost indefinitely. You know, there's just a lot of choices. And even when the stakes are low, sometimes you can find yourself whittling away 15, 20, 60 minutes in a way that doesn't feel commensurate to the benefit of the shea butter. You know what I mean? Like, that's an $8 buy, and it doesn't really matter if I get the third best shea. And yet, the price of my deliberation wasn't really factored into the $8 purchase that I made online, right? So really thinking about the deliberative expense of excessive choosing. You feel me? Smart dude. Okay, another question. Sam asked a question that was very specific to the episode. And it had to do with the kind of attraction trends that Dr. Helen Fisher saw. So, in short, oh wait, can we break? Because it's my mom. She was in the episode. So I'm just going to welcome her. Let's see if that works. For those of you who've heard the episode, you know that I gave my mom my telephone so that she could drive my Tinder. Hola, mami.
Hola, nena.
Did you know that you were asking to be in the video? I just want to make sure I didn't catch you off.
No, I didn't.
Well,
I just wanted to listen in, but hello, everybody. I'll let you kind of focus on Dessa.
Hi, Mom.
Hi.
Thanks for being on the podcast.
It was so much fun. It was so much fun. I really liked it.
Thanks, Mom.
That was a really, really good episode. It makes me really want to listen to the next one.
It was really sweet to watch everybody at the BBC, which is where I've recorded most of this. Like fall in love remotely with my mom. Very sweet, Mom. Okay, I'm gonna X you out so that you don't have to worry about every watching. I love you. Te quiero. Okay. That's Ma. Sam had asked, how do these types that Helen Fisher identified tend to gravitate towards one another? So, for example, Helen Fisher's argument was that a population could be broken down into 4 really rough types with a lot of overlap and a lot of nuance within each community. Those 4 types were estrogen dominant, testosterone dominant, dopamine dominant, or serotonin dominant. And then she described like a personality type for each one. And she found that patterns seemed to emerge between the kind of couples that would form within this quartet of types, right? She found that people who were estrogen dominant tended to be attracted to people who are testosterone dominant. But people who were serotonin dominant tended to want to date other serotonin dominant people. People who were dopamine dominant tended also to want to date within their group. These are broad trends, right? You could absolutely find love and connection with someone in another category, but en masse, she noticed these behaviors. So Sam had asked, hey, I think she caught that I said that the testosterone and estrogen people tended to go together. And I'm going to make a note here. That doesn't mean women or men, biologically or gender identified or otherwise. You can be a man who's cisgendered, who identifies as, who tests as estrogen dominant, or you could be a woman who identifies as cis and heterosexual, and test as testosterone dominant. So, in short, Sam, the dopamine kind of adventure-seeking folks, in very casual shorthand, like to date others of their set. People who are more concerned with tradition and religiosity, who tend to be serotonin dominant, also tend to date within their set. And estrogen and testosterone go this way. So it's an interesting kind of four-square pattern. Did I say males and women? Just sorry. Sorry if I'm getting mealy-mouthed. It's kind of a lot of data. Okay, Lindsay asks, what effect do I think, like, essentially delegating a Tinder swipe to someone else might have? So in short, like, I gave my phone to my mom to swipe on Tinder. And I know that's a thing that people do. Like, Tinder for a long time too was just sort of like a party pastime. You pass around your phone. I'm curious. I mean, I don't know. I don't have enough of a data set to know how many people like met a match that felt worthwhile with someone else driving. I think now at this point in our kind of cultural acceptance of online connections, I do know people who say like, yeah, we met online, we met on Tinder, and that's how we're together. But I have not yet met enough of them to know who was the passenger when somebody else was driving on Tinder. This was such a good one. Okay. This is a question essentially about like the heteronormative undertone of this entire conversation. Karen says, I gotta queer this. If we're talking about choice, shouldn't we talk about all the options? Is there research that similarly considers choice and biology and love when folks are open to any gender or sexuality? Great cue. I have some half answers, some confident answers, and some questions. So I'll hit you with what I got. There was some pretty rad research in a paper presented in 2015 that identified some of the challenges to data collection in same-sex couples in an effort to make that collection easier. So that paper referenced challenges that might sound like familiar in the kind of conversations that we've been having about the way that different racial minorities might engage with essentially research institutions. That there's been a long, robust history of discrimination, right? Which essentially might come at the expense of like trusting relationships and volunteerism in surveys, particularly if you're doing a kind of survey where you want both people in a partnership to participate, right? The other thing that I thought was interesting, which is just a challenge numerically almost, was that, when you talk about kind of longitudinal, like big studies that go for a long time, because we live in a heteronormative society, and because that was even more true, the further back you look in history, at least where I live in the US, that studies would sometimes use length of a marriage as proxy for length of a relationship, which doesn't take into account that couples might have been together either in a non-married way, or they might have just gotten married when it became legal to get married. And so it became difficult to compare it. In that way, it can be difficult to compare two different data sets because the length of a relationship in a same-sex couple might be best described in a different way. I did, however, go back to the study that Helen Fisher ran in 2015, and 10%, just over 10% of those respondents that generated those kind of personality types identified as seeking same-sex partners. So it wasn't an exclusionary study by any measure, near as I can tell. Also, sidebar, I talk about in a later episode of the podcast that deals with sex. I talked briefly, they're only 23 minutes, but I talked briefly with a sex historian about the kind of heteronormative framework, that this entire conversation is happening. And it reminded me of a conversation that I had with a woman who's called the Queen of Pain. And I got to interview her for the podcast at Oxford. And I left with a flesh wound that I consented to. But one of the things that she mentioned was that it's difficult to study female responses to pain, in part because those responses might vary throughout a menstrual cycle. So, to keep their studies clean and neat, there is kind of a natural temptation for researchers to recruit men. I get why it's more complicated, like a confounding variable is a nightmare scenario. Gosh, now do we have to add questions to the survey, right, about where she is in her menstrual cycle, or if she is still menstruating, or what her, like, I get it. That makes the survey way harder. The problem is, the world's full of women. And studying male responses to pain may or may not be a good proxy for the way that women respond to the same tissue damage. Okay, next one. I loved this one. Okay, I have to click through you, so you guys you're safe. Your tripod isn't gonna fall, but I do have to get behind your head and cut and paste. There we go. Oh, this was such a good one. This is from someone called Grant. Lazy data gathering. What's up? Okay, so Grant says, I enjoyed the first episode of Deeply Human. Congrats. Thank you so much, Grant. It feels like our need to categorize also affects dating. Myers-Briggs, the brain systems that we discussed, like people posting, their Hogwarts house to their Twitter feed or whatever. Does this labeling complicate systems? Does this labeling of complicated systems actually serve us well? I think that is such a good question, because I admit that I am really highly skeptical of a lot of categorization. That kind of there's 5 types of people. Take this quiz to find out which kind you are, I think we're naturally attracted to it. And I've certainly taken my share of magazine quizzes and stuff, but I am really highly skeptical of them. And I think that even in the arts, when we're not working in a really rigorous data environment, I'm skeptical there too. Sometimes people will say there's only 5 types of stories. There's these 5 archetypes, or there's 8 archetypes. There's only 21 archetypes for stories. Technically, there's only 2 archetypes for stories. There's stories with squirrels and stories without squirrels. That's technically true, but that's just not really valuable. That's not a great partitioning variable by which to better understand the world. So I would argue that anytime we're typing classes of people by disposition, by trait, by behavior, to be mindful of the lens that we're doing that through, which is hard. Nobody grows up outside of culture, but also to evaluate them strenuously by asking them to be of predictive value. And so that was what I was kind of interested in Dr. Helen Fisher's work, right? She wasn't just saying, hey, there's 4 types of people, take a quiz, this is what you are. It was, hey, there's 4 types of people that seem to behave in ways that we can predict and test, so we can prove ourselves wrong, which is kind of that old astrological problem, right? Everybody thinks they had a hard Tuesday and hopes their luck is turning and we'll have a different a difficult conversation with someone close, in the next 6 months. That all fits. So I thought that was just a great question. This one was slightly above my pay grade, but it was a good one, so I'm going to share it. Allison says that she was studying transgenerational epigenetics. Sorry, this is the worst read. Transgenerational epigenetics, which is the idea that trauma generations ago, as suffered by a relative who endured starvation, for example, can affect the way that your body reads your DNA. And she wondered if that might be true of romantic trauma too. And was there anything that I had come across in my research that would support this idea? I think that transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is fascinating. I was thinking maybe after this I would tweet a link that I really liked to a story by the BBC. I do think that it's one of those things that's important to approach with caution, because first of all, it's just hard. Most of us are not geneticists by training. So make sure we know the words in it, but also it's so exciting sounding that I think it can sometimes be tempting to overstate it, in the same way that, like, you know how we've all read articles that like chocolate's actually good for you, you know, or like 2 glasses of red wine, and then like later it's, I think that it's just such an exciting headline that I'm most eager to read from a writer who is very, very mindful about when to use the freaking turn signals, you know what I mean, and pump the brakes. Somebody who's really taking care to be responsible with it. And I think the article that I was reading, a BBC one from a year or so ago, did so really nicely. Essentially, the idea is, let's see if I can do this. And can't even, sure. Okay, so somebody check me if there are geneticists in this little chat and I mess up, then holler. But essentially, when we think about genetic inheritance, right, we think about genetic code being passed from one generation to the next. But there's also a different and perhaps more subtle way that genetic inheritance might work, where we're not only worried about the code of our genes, right, which is fundamentally fixed throughout our lives, but how those genes are expressed. So if we imagine that the genes are a blueprint for the apartment that I'm sitting in, that's our genetic code. But the way that our genetic code is expressed can be informed by the lives we lead. And essentially, like, chemicals can turn on or off a gene to be expressed. So right now, all the light switches in my apartment will remain in exactly the same places on the walls, but I might go and turn one on, which essentially expresses the gene, right? Or it might remain dormant. The code is the same, but the lighting in the house feels different. So the idea is that if, for example, a population endures starvation or big trauma, so we're thinking like a Swedish famine, we're thinking like the Holocaust, or camps in the Civil War in the U.S., prisoners of war, have been researched as well, that some of that trauma, in fact, might express in later generations as well. The work that I've read usually suggests that that trauma is expressed only through the male line, that it's associated with the Y chromosome. But again, that's limited reading, so holler if I messed it up. You know, I think that the question that you ask, Allison, like, can romance do that too? I think it depends in some way on our collective understanding of trauma. And I think that's really up for debate right now in our culture, you know, the way that we're using that word. And I think the definition is changing, you know, and so we'll change with it. But I know that in some of the reading I've done about what constitutes trauma, like, they weren't saying that a vet who'd seen combat, like, he didn't count as traumatic. Only the guy who was in the prisoner of war camp counted as sufficiently traumatic to be able to see those kind of expressions generations later. So yeah, I am also curious. I'm trying with the parts of the genome written in pen while other parts are written in pencil. Oh, that's interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I guess I had sort of understood it that we have this kind of link that's like a chain link construction that remains stable, that is our code, and then we get essentially like little chemical tags affixed to those genes that would then determine the way that they're expressed. Hey, this is a great little Q&A. Thank you, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for checking out the podcast. Each episode will feature like between 2 and 4 experts, and then usually somebody I know who is game to share like an intimate part of their life that corresponds to the kind of aspect of human nature that we're studying through a more like clinical lens. Okay, thanks, guys. I'll see you for the next listening party for the next IDE single. Okay, good night.